they pretty much had to go on their own. So you had the big four, which was Dan Breen, Treacy, Sean Hogan and Seamus Robinson. So they were always up and down between Tipperary and Dublin. They'd go and meet with the squad, Collins and so on, and if there was an ambush going on, they'd join it.
Sure.
So it's like they're affiliate members of the squad while they're in Dublin.
Yeah.
Because the whole thing of that, you should, a report should come down from the IRA GHQ or an order that, okay, you're going to ambush this place, you're going to ambush this place.
Yeah.
In reality, in the guerrilla war, that's not going to happen.
Yeah.
The fellas decide on the ground, right, this is our moment now, strike, hit and run, boom, we're gone.
Yeah.
Then you then send in your reports to the GHQ and say, look, this is what we did, and they then retrospectively sanction it. Or so then they have the material that they can say, well, this was done for this or whatever. By having that buffer that is Collins there, you have that middleman between the IRA and the ground, the fellas that are actually out fighting the war on a daily basis, on their own, not knowing if they're going to survive, and tragically so many of them didn't, and the IRA GHQ, who are in offices in Dublin City, who are fighting a different war compared to those men that are on the ground, say in Tipperary and in West Cork, because that is the nature of that type of war. You strike when you can, you have to get your opportunity when it arrives, and then you disappear just as quick with minimum losses. So paperwork is an afterthought that way.
Treacy and Breen cycled for Dublin and headed once more for Phil Shanahan's pub. They made contact with Michael Collins, who was at that time the Adjutant General of the Irish Volunteers. Michael Collins undertook to arrange that they should stay in Dublin if they so wished.
Do you want to mention why they were hiding out in Dublin originally?
At Michael Collins' request, he couldn't get the Dublin men to fight. Because, and small blame to them,
They rode back to the country for Seamus Robinson and Sean Hogan. Dan Breen was in disguise dressed as a priest. Seamus Robinson was once asked how he would go to confession. Robinson's reply was, "When I go to confession, I go to confess my sins, not to boast of my virtues."
They were determined not to run away, or not to go to America.
On the 19th of September 1919, Sir Frederick Shaw suggested that the police force in Ireland be expanded by the recruitment of a special force of volunteer British ex-servicemen. The Black and Tans and Auxiliary Division of the Constabulary were introduced in order to achieve a decisive result. The Black and Tan force was the brainchild of Winston Churchill, then British Secretary of State for War. Recruitment began in late 1919 in Britain. Many of those Black and Tans were British Army veterans of World War I. The Black and Tans were soon to become notorious for their attacks on civilians and civilian property.
This is late 1919. At this point, the intelligence was really getting into its own.
Phil Shanahan's pub on Dublin's Corporation Street was a useful source for obtaining weapons. British servicemen often had their weapons relieved by the local prostitutes. Dublin's Corporation Street was beside a flourishing red light district. Dan Breen has said, "The lady prostitutes used to pinch the guns at night and then leave them for us at Phil Shanahan's public house. There was no such thing as payment for these transactions or any information that they gave us."
Kieran, could you tell me what happened here?
This is Phil Shanahan's pub. He was in the first stall and IRA man.
Okay.
This is where all the main leaders of the 1916 Rising and War of Independence used to come. My grandfather, Tom Kelly, was manager at the time when Phil was in jail, and he used to have Michael Collins in, and Sean Treacy and Dan Breen.
John Kelly, son of Tom Kelly.
Okay, and
Kieran Kelly, grandson of Tom Kelly.
and
Frank Kelly, son of Tom Kelly.
how was he involved in intelligence gathering?
Very much so with Michael Collins.
Yeah.
Actually, he had a hiding place in Shannon's pub for Collins' revolver.
Really?
Whenever Collins didn't want to be taken on the seat.
Right.
And
the British soldiers could never, as often as they walked in to raid the place, they never found it, even though it was under their noses.
So I believe there's a story with a bicycle.
Yeah, Sean Treacy, I think it was round New Inn it happened. Sean Treacy got a puncture in his bicycle, and he was stopped on the road, and the British soldiers came and mended the puncture for him, but they didn't know who he was. They didn't recognise him.
But I read in the Sean Treacy in the Time War that Michael Collins he liked Treacy's style, basically, the way he ran the flying column, that he depended on Sean Treacy a lot, and that I understand, I think, a meeting with Michael Collins, that Sean Treacy bought his fiancée May Quigley, and Sean Treacy corrected Michael Collins over his language in front of a lady, and got Michael Collins to apologise in front of May, saying he shouldn't be losing language like that in front of his fiancée, which Michael Collins did apologise, and he toned down the language after that. He was corrected over it.
He went up very bad language.
Yeah.
He didn't like bad language.
Really?
Something, yeah.
Okay, it's interesting.
He corrected people at meetings sometimes if they use bad language.
Right.
Yeah, and that he had his, he was a practicing Catholic.
Michael Collins was very influenced by Sean Treacy and the way that he ran the squad.
Well, after the start of the War of Independence in Solihull, when Treacy and Breen were asked to come to Dublin by Collins, it was to Phil Shannon's they went, and that's how my grandfather got to know Breen and Treacy very well.
Phil Shannon's pub was one of the leading. Phil Shannon was one of the best freedom fighters we had. My father worked with him, and when he was in the GPO with Michael Collins, he kept the pub going there. Phil Shannon was a legend in his own lifetime. A legend.
His pub was only off O'Connell Street, down Foley Street. Well, it was Monto, Montgomery Street back then. It was one of the hotbeds of War of Independence. It was one of the communication points where all the leaders went, and especially Michael Collins, Dan Breen, Sean Treacy, they were all kept up there, and the British were looking for them, I suppose. Even the hands used to go in there looking for Treacy and Breen. My grandfather used to say, go on upstairs there, and then they wouldn't bother going up.
It was like calling the bluff kind of thing. Dare you.
The RIC were still looking for Sean Treacy and his comrades. They were soon to learn of this when they arrived at Gould's Cross Station. The RIC were waiting at the station for them. The first person to notice them was Sean Hogan, who warned his companions. They had turned towards the engine before the police realised what had happened. The four men at once opened fire with their revolvers. As the police rushed towards them and opened fire on them, they jumped onto the railway line and escaped. Seamus Robinson has said, "We were awakened out of our sleep one night in Mrs. Boland's house in Dublin by the sound of trampling footsteps and loud voices on the stairs. Mick soon let us know the object of his visit, saying, 'Get up at once, you're to ambush Lord French.'" Dan Breen has said, "Why, we asked ourselves, should we not strike at the very heads of the British government in Ireland? Britain could survive the loss of a few peelers. It would be more difficult to do without a Lord Lieutenant."
They realised with good leadership, they nearly took out the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, returning from French Park in Westcommon.
Well, at this point, the intelligence system that was, controlled by Michael Collins was really getting into its own. They had an office in Crow Street in Temple Bar, just behind where the Central Bank is today, and it's amazing because it's it's a stone's throw from Dublin Castle. It was, cloaked as a business, but the business at hand was collecting intelligence. In this office, Collins had 4 or 5 volunteers working in there, and their job was pretty much to go through newspaper cuttings. So they'd see something in the newspaper, in the Independent or the Times or the Stubbs Gazette or fashion magazines or whatever, to say that such and such a figure was going to be attending such and such a function. In a nutshell, Michael Collins' intelligent network knew more about Lord French's movements than a lot of Lord French's own staff. I mean, for example, they tried so many times to get at him.
Dan Breen has said, Collins was with us on the first occasion that we lay in ambush. Tom McCurtain was also in our ranks. Dick McKee also kept us company. I remember waiting with Padder Clancy for 2 hours outside the door of a Merrion Square specialist whom French occasionally visited. Certainly Mick organised this attack on French. He mobilised the men for it, and he was out himself that morning. Seamus Robinson witness statement.
To put it again in a modern context, we have a president. He lives in Áras an Uachtaráin. This was the Lord Lieutenant who lived in the Viceregal Lodge, which is today Áras an Uachtaráin. Yeah. He was the head of the British administration in Ireland. Now, as Dan Breen so eloquently puts it in his wonderful book, that they could go out and engage enemy soldiers or enemy, the police at any time, but they could be replaced just like that. They were in effect pawns in a chess game. Lord French was the king in the same chess game. They wanted to do it on his own doorstep and therefore send out a statement to the world that Ireland was in a state of war.
Seamus Robinson has said, at first we were put on the track of G-men, then spies, then big game, Lord French.
That he was coming from French Park in County Roscommon, but if they'd carried it out there, they would have been seen more like bandits. Breen said in his book that they could have got there very easily, and they also could have returned very easily. This was a high-risk operation, but they felt that in propaganda terms, that just justified the risks they were taking. Just previous to the Ashtown ambush, they tried to get him on the first anniversary of the armistice, when there was a function going on in Trinity College.
Twice or three times we missed him by a single street, the altering of his route by a slight digression. During the last 3 months of 1919, we planned no less than 12 ambushes in an effort to get him. Dan Breen.
They planned on getting him as he came down the North Quays from the Phoenix Park.
11th of November. Our plan was to bomb his car as he passed Grattan Bridge. We knew the very hour he was expected to travel along the quays from the Viceregal Lodge to Trinity College. Dan Breen. On one occasion I remember, there was some kind of a function being held in the Provost's house in Trinity College. We were mobilised by Mick MacDonald to take up positions around and about Grafton Street. Vinnie Byrne.
But it's kind of comical when you look back on it, but the volunteers, Sean Hogan was known to be a little bit trigger happy with hand grenades, and he was standing there with the pins already pulled on a hand grenade. Ready to throw it as soon as Lord French came down. But while they were waiting, they were standing in the open on Capel Street Bridge in a snowstorm, and it was only when somebody came to them and kind of suggested, lads, you look a little bit suspicious standing out in the open here in a snowstorm, you might want to go and get some cover. That way you won't be as conspicuous and you might have a chance of doing whatever it is you're planning to do.
Yeah. So certain were they that he was on the way, but he never came. They held the grenades for over 2 hours. 5 minutes after they went home, lorry loads of military searched everyone. Detectives had reported them, but the military just missed them.
This was only one of numerous incidents. Lord French seemed to have a charmed life.
Seamus Robinson has said, Dick Mulcahy explained to us that we would have to carry out active warfare in such a way that there would be no casualties on our side. He said this was necessary because the government was anxious that no military action should be traced to its authority or to the IRA, and that if an attack could be traced to the IRA, they might find it necessary to repudiate us. Seamus Robinson witness statement.
Dáil Éireann was still in its infancy.
Yeah.
It had only been declared the previous January. At that point in the War of Independence, they were reluctant to align themselves with a lot of these. If it was today, they'd be considered terrorists.
Yeah.
The Paris Peace Conference was going on in 1919. They were presenting themselves as the legitimately elected government of a country. Therefore, it wouldn't have been very, very good public relations in that regard to be sanctioning assassinations of government ministers, in effect.
Okay.
Lord French, he was a thorn in the side of the IRA. They did try to get him on numerous occasions, but each time they failed.
How crucial were they to the War of Independence?
They were vitally important to it, and people would, tend to disagree with the actions that they did. So that's why you have them being involved in the ambush on Lord French, the attempted ambush on Lord French at Ashtown.
Against the old soldier himself, we had no personal spite, but he was the head of an alien government that held our country in bondage. We knew that his death would arouse the world to take notice of our fight for freedom. Dan Breen. Vinnie Byrne, a member of Collins' squad, heard from Paddy Sharkey in a Sinn Féin club that Lord French would be returning to Dublin around 11 or 12. Vinnie immediately told Mick McDonnell. The Viceroy's special train was due to arrive at Ashtown at 11:40 a.m. Half an hour earlier, our party had arrived on the scene. Dan Breen. And then scoot up. Race.
The volunteers were positioned. Kelly's, the halfway house, was just where that roundabout is there now. As we can see, it's moved since. The volunteers were positioned on this side of the road, heading down towards the Ashtown railway station, which is just down there where the level crossing is now.
They cycled by the Cabra Road in pairs. They left their bicycles outside Kelly's. The Big Four, under the command of Paddy Daly, together with Mick McDonnell, Tom Keogh, Martin Savage, Vincent Byrne, Tom Kilcoyne and Joe Leonard, cycled out the Cabra Road to Ashtown Cross. Savage sang songs like A Soldier's Life, The Life for Me, A Soldier's Death, So Ireland's Free. Explain the Kelly's corner at Ashtown Cross, showing the railway by road to the left. The memorial marks the spot where Martin Savage fell. Where is that now?
Just here. If you look at the line of the road that comes up from the railway station, the way it bends around here. The Ashtown railway station, which is just down there where the level crossing is now. That's where it was in 1919. They had arrived in twos by bicycle. The halfway house it was named the halfway house because it was the halfway house between pretty much Dublin and County Meath. You would have had, again, it's very agricultural, a lot of farmers around here. This would have been a stop-off point for traders going in and out of the city from the direction of what is today Blanchardstown and beyond. They went in twos. Most of them drank minerals. At the same time as well, it would look suspicious if everybody was ordering minerals, and they were, after all, going into a pub, but it was fairly early in the day. A couple of them ordered alcoholic drinks because they didn't want to stand out too much, and then they had to talk about agricultural matters, which most of them knew little or nothing about, just so as they wouldn't again stand out to the locals that were in there and draw unnecessary attention to themselves. It's a perfect place for an ambush. Once they ambushed them, if they block the road, there's nowhere for the convoy to go. They can't turn. At least not at any good time. That road was narrower at the time. I mean, if for argument's sake, if they planned the ambush over here, there was a road here, which obviously wasn't as wide as it is today, but it would have given them an extra escape route, which they didn't want to do. So therefore, it was done on this side. Made sense. They had dispatched a volunteer down to the station itself. Paddy Daly would have been just over here. If you look down here, you had hedges on this side of the road. This was fields. Paddy Daly was in a position where he could look down.
Mick called me and told me to get my bike, cycle towards the station and see if there was any sign of the train, or if there were any military or police there. I had only gone about 200 yards when I heard the sound of motor cars coming behind me. A motor horn sounded and I pulled into the side to let them pass. There were 4 cars in all. Vinnie Byrne, witness statement.
With the Lord French attack, the intelligence that they had was that he was travelling, I think, in the second car, but then he was actually travelling in the first car.
They wanted to find out which car to make sure that Lord French was going to be in the second car. He normally travelled in the second car. Anytime they'd tried to get it previously, he was in the second car. So they'd sent this volunteer down with instructions to do a certain signal. If he was in the first car, second car, or the third car, tip his hat or whatever, blowing his nose, signalled that he was in the second car, and when he did, they therefore assumed that he was in the second car, which was a Navy car. However, by the time the convoy came up here, they didn't realise that the car had actually moved, it had switched position in the convoy. He had an uncanny look, Lord French.
I noticed Sean Treacy glancing at his watch from time to time. Eager eyes kept a constant watch on the crossroads. We had a clear view of everyone who passed by on the main road or on the road which led to the park. Dan Breen.
It was preceded by a motorbike outrider.
Beside Kelly's, a heavy farm cart rested on its shafts. Tom Keogh, Martin Savage and I had been instructed to push this cart right across the road at the last moment and block the passage of French's car. The road was too narrow to allow two cars to travel abreast, and the heavy farm cart would compel them to slow down. At the same moment, the other members of our party were to open a deadly attack with bombs and grenades on the Lord Lieutenant's car. After the attack, they were to rely on the revolvers for dealing with the military guard, Dan Breen. The train arrived early, giving the ambushers little time to get in position at the hedge. Daly, Leonard, Treacy, Robinson and Hogan went into the backyard of the pub and into a field where they took up position behind the hedge covering the road. The remainder of us took up positions at the corner of the main Navan Road and the road leading to the station. A false step taken half a second too soon might upset the whole plan. We stepped out to the crossroads. Our men quietly took up their positions. Tom Keogh, Martin Savage and I were standing beside the farm cart. It was time to get it in motion. Dan Breen.
Policeman, Dublin Metropolitan Policeman, he came down from this direction here, from just the Park Lodge.
Yeah.
And he was dressed in his best because he knew that the Lord French, the Lord Lieutenant, was due in. And his job was to stand here at the crossroads as it was then.
Yeah.
And stop any traffic, just to keep anybody back, to allow Lord French to pass through. When he came down, he stumbled upon Dan Breen and the other two trying to push this cart out on the road.
So why are they using the cart?
Well, they wanted to slow down or stop the convoy.
And where would the cart have been?
Well, the cart was just on the far side of it was in a little yard of the pub. Now the pub was something, it looked like a shack.
Yeah.
It was a lot smaller than this.
The ambushers had one advantage, the element of surprise. We had made ourselves familiar with every inch of the locality, every bush and turn in the road, every nook and corner. Dan Breen.
But it was a manure cart just on the far side of it. I mean, this was a very agricultural area at the time. But they didn't realise how heavy. They couldn't rehearse this, so they didn't realise how heavy the cart actually was. The plan was to barricade the road with the cart, but ultimately they couldn't do that. There was a policeman came down from his lodge was just inside the gate of the Phoenix Park. This is where the DMP guy came out, and the gate is the same. Okay. And he says that he came from inside the gate.
All right.
He came down this road here because he was going to be directing traffic. This was the old Navan Road, it was a main road, and he was going to be stopping traffic too. He knew that His Excellency, as they used to address him, Lord French, was going to be on his way up when the train pulled in shortly after 11:40 a.m.
French's party took less time than we had expected to get into the cars and come from the station. I gave the signal for the car to be brought out, and I put Paddy Daly and 4 others inside the hedge with hand grenades. After telling them to concentrate on the second car and some other details, I turned to the cart again and found they were bringing it through the gate with the shafts first, instead of the way I had told them. I started swearing and shouted, "Why didn't you push it out the way I told you?" That delayed them trying to turn it outside the gate. We lost much time in doing so. Colonel Michael MacDonald, witness statement 225.
You cannot go down there for a while, the big policeman shouted. His Excellency is to pass along here in a few seconds. I tried to ignore the policeman. He evidently thought I was too stupid for this world. He went on protesting to me, explaining how necessary it was to have the road clear for His Excellency's car. He was apparently too dense to notice that I had 2 guns in my hands. Dan Breen.
He obviously told them that they had to stop, but he had no inclination whatsoever as to what they were doing, and they kind of played up to that just by acting dick. That's the best way to put it.
Yeah.
But it didn't work. And this was when one of the other volunteers decided that it was time to get rid of him. But a volunteer threw a hand grenade which hit the unfortunate policeman in the head.
One of the men could see what was going on and hurled the grenade straight at the policeman's head, endangering the lives of Breen, Savage and Keogh. The grenade struck the policeman's head and exploded, knocking everyone to the ground. The dispatch rider zoomed past from the station. Suddenly, French's motorcyclist Scout dashed by. The first car came 50 yards later. It went through as per orders without challenge. A second later came the first motor. We dashed right in, front of it and opened fire on the occupants. Our fire was at once returned, and so close were we to the enemy that my lovely new hat was shot right off my head. Dan Breen. As the cars approached, the men behind the hedge opened fire with revolvers and grenades. The first car to come was a dark blue one. Sitting beside the driver was a man in civilian clothes, who, we learned afterwards, was Detective Officer Haley. He was firing from a revolver.
Sean Hogan and Paddy Daly, they fell. A grenade slipped out of Sean Hogan's hand. The two of them just fell straight to the ground. That was the only thing that they could do. The grenade went off and it showered the pair of them and covered them in muck. And Paddy Daly said it in his witness statement that he wanted to give Sean Hogan a right verbal scene to, but when Hogan got up and he saw the amount of muck that he was covered in, he just saw the funny side of it and couldn't. But at the same time as well, they had other more important pressing concerns, i.e. enemy fire.
Yeah. The cart hadn't completely blocked the road and the first car sped by. The second car took the brunt of the rain of bullets and grenades. Daly landed a grenade into the second car. It swerved and crashed into a ditch.
What kind of shelter did Breen, Savage and Keogh have?
Very little. This was a manure cart. It wasn't very big, and considering that the amount of fire that was coming back, because there was a lot of British soldiers, as you can imagine, in the convoy. This was the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland. He was in effect, he with the same position as the President has today. But the country was, it was 1919. It wasn't full on 1920 at this point. Yeah. But the authorities were well aware, that there was an imminent threat every time Lord French went out.
Okay.
So he had quite a few troops with him, and judging from what happened, some of them would have been very, very well trained in marksmanship. The accounts of the battle do vary, but at the same time, this is something that happened in a very, very, very high-speed situation. This is an ambush where you've got a force of the best part of a dozen volunteers, and they're going up against significant number of the enemy. Yeah. Within a stone's throw of where the enemy can get reinforcements to the spot very, very quickly. So an ambush by its very, very nature is going to go off very, very quickly. It's going to be very, very haphazard. In the confusion of what happened, there were several grenades thrown. One of the grenades was actually thrown into the second car, and it destroyed the second car. It badly wounded the soldier who was driving the second car, among several other people. The first car Lord French was in, a grenade, I think, was rolled under that, and it didn't explode.
Robinson then lobbed his reserve grenade at the first car. Detective Sergeant Haley, French's bodyguard, was slightly wounded, and he retaliated by throwing a grenade behind him. But French had escaped in the armour-plated first car.
But I saw a photograph of the same car afterwards, where a soldier was pointing at a bullet hole in it, so it was hit by fire. Some of the volunteers have said they could hear the shots whistling through the air as they went past their heads. They were hitting off walls behind them.
The enemy brought machine guns and rifles into action, and there we stood, an easy target, while we poured volley after volley into car number 2. Bullets whistled past and grenades burst at our feet. So close were we to our objective that we were also endangered by the bombs which our own men were hurling from the ditch. Dan Breen.
Okay. And in the middle of all this was when Martin Savage got shot on the neck at pretty much the same time as Dan Breen got shot on the leg. There was obviously one of the British marksmen, I think he was shooting from a car. He must have been a very good shot because he was on the move, and this happened 1, 2, 3, where you had Breen's hat being blown off his head, you had him being shot in the leg, didn't even realise it at the time, as a lot of soldiers don't realise when you're shot in the soft tissue like that. And then Martin Savage, he turned around and saw him lying on the ground. He went over and he heard his last words.
Suddenly, to our dismay, another car came rushing towards us from the opposite direction. We were now in greater danger than ever, for we were trapped between two lines of fire. I felt a bullet pierce my left leg, but I had not time to examine the wound, though I reckon that the bullet had passed through. Dan Breen. Breen, Savage and Keogh were now swept by 4 soldiers with rifles and a machine gunner from the open third car. As the car came clear of the corner, I let fly my grenade, which hit the back of the car and exploded. The next thing I saw was the peeler being blown across the road. The second car was stopped right opposite our men behind the hedge. This car was a closed one, khaki green in colour. The third car was a box Ford type with a canvas roof, which flew by with a continuous fire on it. Vinnie Byrne, witness statement. The fourth car which came along was an open sunbeam car, and in it were a soldier driver and a sergeant. The sergeant was lying across the back of the car firing from a rifle. Vinnie Byrne. The British had by this time several rifles and a machine gun in action, but the marksmen's nerves must have failed them, otherwise we could never have put up such a sustained resistance. Dan Breen. Seamus Robinson recalls, in the back of the car stood a soldier with his legs braced between the seats, his rifle held tight to his soldier with the left hand and his right hand working evenly, almost gracefully, on the bolt and trigger. The soldier was a sharpshooter. His first shot gave young Martin Savage his death wound. The second went through Breen's hat, and the third hit Breen in the leg. As this car was disappearing around the wide bend of the road leading to the Ashtown gate of the Phoenix Park, I heard Martin Savage saying something, and it sounded like this. "Oh lads, I am hit." Martin Savage fell into my arms, fatally wounded. I laid my dying comrade down on the roadside. His lips were moving as if he had a last message to give me. I stooped and put my ear to his lips and heard the words spoken faintly, "I'm done, Dan. Carry on." To my last hour I shall remember Martin bleeding to death by the roadside on that December day, while bullets whizzed as in a raging hailstorm, striking everything but myself at whom they were aimed. Dan Breen. By this time Tom Keogh had got back to cover. I looked around to see if I had any chance of escape. There seemed none. The blood was streaming from my leg. The enemy's fire was fierce and rapid, while ours had eased off. Our grenades had been exploded. Most of our revolvers were empty. Amidst a hail of bullets, I dashed around the corner for the shelter of Kelly's house and reached it in safety. I fired one more shot. There was no counter-volley. The khaki warriors had fled for the safety of the park. The whole vice-regal party followed. We surveyed our spoils. That hapless second car, riddled with bullets, driver McAvoy disabled, one wounded Constable O'Loughlin of the Dublin Metropolitan Police. Dan Breen. Were there any casualties on the British side?
The driver of the second car was badly wounded, and he staggered out of the car expecting to be shot. This was an ambush, so he wasn't going to be taken prisoner as far as he was concerned. But I mean, the attitude of the volunteers was, he was an unarmed enemy. They weren't going to shoot him, so they let him go. The policeman was let go as well. But there would have been other British wounded as well. But bear in mind, you're going to have shrapnel, you're going to have stray bullets flying everywhere. But most of these guys were in vehicles, so if the vehicle made it out of there, so did the soldier. The second car was just taken out. It was hit with that many bullets. There was a grenade landed in it. Its driver was very badly wounded.
The ambushers were sure French lay dead in the mangled ruins of the second car. Breen, badly wounded, took shelter in the halfway house. Robinson took cover behind a milk cart. The third car swooshed into Phoenix Park with a final burst of lethal gunfire. At this time we were looking down the road towards the station, and I observed smoke coming out of the second car, which was stopped. Also I saw a hand waving a handkerchief. Someone shouted to him to come out with his hands up, which the soldier did. He was the driver of the car. Mick MacDonald, I think, asked him where was French, and the soldier replied, "Blown to bits in the car." As he was standing in front of us, someone suggested that he should be plugged. Someone else replied, "Oh, it's not him we wanted," so he was let go in safety. Vinnie Byrne, witness statement.
Well, the first thing was they wanted to get Martin Savage's body somewhere. And this would have happened really, really quickly. Bear in mind, as I said, an ambush has just taken place on the most senior government figure in the country. And they've got away, but you've still got a very, very, hot, fluid situation. But they didn't want to leave a comrade lying on the road. So they went and they at this point, the owner of the pub had barred the door shut. So they were banging on the door to try and get Martin Savage's body inside, but he wouldn't open up, the pub owner, so they had to leave his body outside. At that point, they got onto their bicycles and they hightailed it towards the city, down along the Navan Road towards Cabra. Dan Breen was shot in the leg, so he wasn't going to be able to cycle, so he hopped onto the back of Paddy Daly's bike.
Breen's wounded leg was useless. They went to Mrs. Toomey's house in Phibsborough. There Breen was seen by 2 doctors. Paddy said to me, "You carry on, Vincey. We're all right now. I'll look after Dan." I proceeded across town and was home in nice time for my dinner. Vinnie Byrne, witness statement.
How did they escape?
On the same bicycles that had brought them to the ambush. One of the volunteers' bicycles, the frame collapsed on it.
He balanced himself on Sean Treacy's bicycle. A bicycle was taken from an RIC pensioner. Seamus gave him an assurance that if he called to the Gresham Hotel at a particular time, he would get it back. Robinson was true to his word.
So they borrowed, well, you could say borrowed, I mean, at the point of a gun, somebody else's
RIC.
an RIC, but they borrowed his bicycle, but they gave him a reassurance. It's kind of comical if you think about the situation where this has just happened, but they still have the wherewithal, to say, sorry about that, we'll make sure your bike is okay. And lo and behold, a couple of days later, the bicycle did turn up at the Gresham Hotel. He received notification that the bicycle would be left outside the Gresham Hotel. He went in and he retrieved it.
At nightfall, Dublin rang with the newsboys' cry. Attack on the Lord Lieutenant. Sensational fight at Ashtown. One of the attackers shot dead. Dan Breen. Sir John French had escaped unhurt. It was true. We had failed. It was the first occasion on which the Viceroy had travelled not in the second car, but in the first. The car about which we had scarcely bothered actually bore safely away the man whom we wanted to dispatch. Dan Breen. In Dolphin's Barn, Treacy and Robinson read that French had once more escaped. Later that week in the cinema, they watched an item called Scene of the Ashtown Ambush. This was the last attempt on French. He gave up all public journeys and seldom left the Viceregal Lodge after this incident. Sean Treacy's motto was, "Always make the best of things." He tried to console me by saying, "You can't have a knock long every day, Dan." Dan Breen. Lord French, after the ambush, retired from public life, and armoured cars and detectives accompanied him to London. The plain people were more guarded in expressing their opinions. The country was beginning to realise that we meant war with Britain, until, to quote the words of O'Donovan Rossa, she was stricken to her knees, or we were stricken to our graves. It was the turning point. In private, many defended our standpoint. Dan Breen. On the morning after the attack, the Irish Independent published a leading article in which we were dubbed assassins. The article was liberally interspersed with such terms as criminal folly, outrage, murder. This was the very paper which depended on the support of the people who had voted for the establishment of the Irish Republic. The other Dublin papers we did not mind. The Irish Times was openly a British organ. The Freeman's Journal was beneath the contempt of any decent Irishman. But we could not allow an avowedly Irish paper to insult our dead comrade. Dan Breen. Lieutenant Martin Savage had been an assistant in Kirk's Provisions, North Strand. He lived over the shop. After the attack, Tom Keogh, anticipating a raid on Kirk's premises by the British, as soon as they established Savage's identity, hurried to the shop on North Strand Road, went to Savage's room and removed any of his belongings that were of a military nature or gave a clue to the identity of his associates. Keogh was only just clear of the premises when the British forces appeared. Martin's body was handed over to his 2 brothers, who wished to place his body in Dublin Church for the night before bringing it for burial in his native Ballysodare, County Sligo, next morning. The Pro-Cathedral and his parish church, St. Lawrence O'Toole's, refused. He was left in a boxcar at Broadstone railway station overnight. Michael McDonnell, witness statement. Richard Mulcahy said that General Headquarters had decided we would not march through the streets in military formation after Martin Savage's remains. With my brother Leo Henderson and others, we stood at the Broadstone station when Savage's remains were entrained. We stood to attention and saluted as the train moved out. The Irish Independent published an editorial in which it referred to him and the other IRA soldiers who took part in the attack on Lord French as murderers and assassins. General Headquarters considered that this was an invitation to the British to treat them as criminals. A raid was organised on the printing works of the paper. The smashing of vital machines was ordered as a warning to the proprietors of the Independent and other papers that such unpatriotic comment at the height of the fight for freedom would not be tolerated. Frank Henderson, witness statement. I was confined to bed and had no direct part in subsequent events. I heard that some of the boys favoured the shooting of the editor of the Independent. It was decided to suppress the paper. At 9 o'clock on Sunday night, 20 or 30 of our men, under the leadership of Padder Clancy, entered the building and held up the staff with revolvers. They informed the editor that his machinery was to be dismantled. They smashed the linotypes with sledges and left the place in such condition that it was hoped no edition would appear for some time. The Independent was operating by the next day. Many of the staff in the Independent were members of the IRA, according to Dan Breen. Never afterwards did the Independent or any other Dublin newspaper refer to members of the IRA as murderers or assassins. The proprietors got £16,000 compensation for the raid. Dan Breen. The government of the Republic, Dáil Éireann, did not wish to associate itself directly with our actions. I wish to emphasise that neither then nor at any later stage did Dáil Éireann accept responsibility for the war against the British. To quote General Mulcahy, the IRA was left to carry on the war on its own initiative, on its own resources, without either approval or disapproval from the government of the Republic. Dan Breen. At the inquest held over Martin Savage's body, it was stated by police witnesses that the assailants fled and were pursued. I became almost hysterical with laughter when I read these words, remembering the British soldiers' precipitate flight for the cover of the Phoenix Park wall. The plan to attack French was not led by personal feeling against him. Breen said, "I must say I am glad now that Lord French escaped." Robinson joked, "I am sure he was as delighted as we were disappointed."
With then Breen and others, they didn't ever run away from the authorities. They never went out of their way to avoid British soldiers, black and tans, and never deterred from taking action.
For 3 whole months after Ashtown, Dan Breen was invalided and looked after by Bridget and Anya Malone.
That's my mother.
Okay.
That's my mother.
What was her name? Just so I have
Anya Malone.
Anya Malone, okay.
And that's my mother again, and Auntie Bee, their sister.
Would you like to tell me a little bit more about the Dan Breen connection?
He married Mammy's sister.
Mum's mum, Anya, and Breen, as you know, they were sisters and they got on very well together.
Okay.
Breen was the youngest of the two, and she married.
Yeah. He was the utmost gentleman. His two Donald and Grania loved him.
Both of the girls, Bridget and Anya Malone, were active members of the Cumann na mBan. They carried our dispatches and even helped in the removal of munitions to Kingsbridge Station. We were constantly in search of arms or ammunition, which we either bought or took in raids. Invariably, we sent them on to our South Tipperary Brigade, for they badly needed the stuff. There were far fewer chances of getting arms or ammunition in Tipperary than there were in Dublin. Very often we consigned the contraband by train in boxes labelled tea or wines or some such commodity. At the other end, we had made arrangements which would ensure that the goods would be received by a merchant who was a member of the IRA.
And she'd be bringing stuff. She was going down the country with ammunition one day, and the train would know if there was a specials branchman on the train. And it didn't stop this day where it was meant to stop in. The driver would stop in between, she'd get out, and Uncle Dan's crowd or J.J. Hove's girl or somebody would be waiting
Okay.
to collect the ammunition. And this man said to her, when they eventually got off, he said, I'll take your bag. I know she is not. Go on. He said, you're a fine load there, man, be careful. He was a special branch man. Now, my mother died young. She was only 50 when she died.
Okay.
And TB was the epidemic that time, and she, a nurse, diagnosed herself as having cancer. But at any rate, years afterwards, I was reading the paper, and it never dawned on me, because he called her Mear Malone to try and get in touch with my mother. And it just dawned on me, he was the special branch man.
Yeah.
And he must have lost his wife or somebody. Wasn't he looking for my mother?
Right.
But I never connected it up because he called her Mary Fitzgerald. You know?
I see, yes.
Wasn't it a good one? You're a fine load there, ma'am, he said, be careful. And very few would have allowed them to go.
Yeah.
See, the train used to stop at Knocklonger between stations.
Yeah.
So our mother out, and the boys would be there. They weren't boys, but they were called, the IRA were called the boys.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
And they'd be there. But that day it passed through, so they knew there was somebody on the train. Took out bags, you fine load there, man, be careful. But it's true as God. My mother died too young, but after she died, wasn't this on the paper? Never dawned to me. Looking for Mary Malone.
Yeah.
And it was he that saved her life. And by golly, if it dawned on me,
Yeah.
I'd have written to thank him. She wouldn't be telling us, but they'd be talking about it in the stores, like we, either on the stairs or lying at the sliding door on the floor. And she knew we were listening, because she genuinely wanted it. We wouldn't have taken it in half as much if we weren't allowed to listen to it. But because the door was slightly down at that, we were lying down, listening to all this, thrilled to bits with history on her, yeah. She was a great woman, though, she really was.